we are now accessible to whoever wants to view
Yeah,
us.
I see we have a lot of participants already on the call.
Okay, great. So let's get this started.
Get this party going, Margaret.
Yay! So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today. This is the 18th annual Irish American Crossroads Festival. Thank you for joining us at the Crossroads online this year. And we're really excited about this event with Eamonn Flynn and Laura Kelley speaking to us today about the Irish in New Orleans. So I'm just going to say a few words about each of our presenters today, and then Eamonn is going to take it from there and lead us into the journey of learning about the Irish in New Orleans with Laura Kelley. Eamonn Flynn is a piano player, singer, and songwriter from Dublin, Ireland. Born into a musical family, he first came to prominence playing the Hammond organ and piano on the $14 million selling movie soundtrack, The Commitments. Eamonn's 2019 album, Black Coddle, explored some of the common threads between Irish and New Orleans music. For more information, please visit his website.
Can I just say, Margaret, sorry to interrupt. I thought you were going to say I made $14 million from it. That would have been, but unfortunately I didn't.
Would have been nice.
Yeah, right?
Would that it were, yes. And Laura Kelley is an immigrant and ethnic historian at Tulane University and the program director of Tulane's Summer in Dublin program. Her book, The Irish in New Orleans, was released in October 2014 and is the winner of the bronze medal in the regional nonfiction category of the Independent Publisher Awards. She's currently completing her second manuscript, The Greening of New Orleans. So lovely to have both of you here at the Crossroads online, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you.
So, first of all, thank you for asking us to do this as part of the Crossroads Festival. You guys put on an amazing festival every year, and we're really happy to be a part of it. Like, there's always really interesting subjects about Irish Americans in San Francisco and the rest of the US. So you put on great shows, so great events. So thanks for inviting us to do this. We have a very special guest here. I want to give your book a plug, Laura. This is such a great book. Dr. Laura Kelley, professor of history at Tulane, author of a wonderful book called The Irish in San Francisco, The Irish in New Orleans, which is where I got the genius idea for the title of this event. Not only is this a wonderful book in terms of information, it's just beautiful in terms of pictures. Like it's just full of wonderful photographs and illustrations that really take you back to the whole story of the Irish in New Orleans through the years. And I guess, I just, one thing to tee this off, it's kind of as far as I know, it's a little bit of an underreported story in that there's a lot of information out there about the Irish emigrating to New York, to the cities in the north, to New York, Boston, Chicago. I never knew so many people from Ireland emigrated to New Orleans. So it was really fascinating for me to discover that. But I'm really intrigued to know, Laura, like how I know you're originally from New York, right?
Yeah.
Why New Orleans? Why the Irish in New Orleans? What drew you to this subject?
So it's not the answer that I think most people expect, and that is, so my last name is Kelley, and immigrant historians have a tendency to study their own group. So if I were Italian, I'd be studying Italian immigrants. If I had Polish heritage, I might be studying the Polish. I moved to New Orleans because I was actually interested in its French and Spanish background to do my PhD. And it was different from the 13 colonies British narrative. And so I thought, this is interesting. And of course, it's, New Orleans. So that was the reason. And when I got off the plane and into a taxi cab, and I'm going to check out Tulane University, and I'm in this cab, first time in New Orleans, and I'm talking to the cab driver, and the cab driver yakking away. And I kind of said, when did you move to New Orleans? Because he had this New York accent and pronounced New York accent. And he said, move? I've never left New Orleans. I was like, what? And I said, wait, like, where are you from? He's like, I'm from the Channel. I was like, the what? The Channel? The what? The Irish Channel. And at that point, he must have thought I was a complete idiot. And I heard about this neighborhood in New Orleans called the Irish Channel. And that just intrigued me. And I thought, well, maybe it's just the name of a neighborhood or something like that. And then I found out, no, that there was this huge Irish population that came in the 19th century, and that really, other than one study, nobody had looked at this group. And so I immediately said, well, there you go. A study is born. And that was all due to a cab ride. So you never know what will happen and when inspiration hits. And it's been fantastic. And I have to tell you, one of the best things about studying the Irish in New Orleans is that everybody knows the New York story and the Boston story and things like that. Yeah. And when they hear New Orleans in the South, they're immediately intrigued in a way that I think would be different than if I said I was doing a study about the Irish in Chicago. They'd be like, yeah, you and 5 other people. So I always have an audience that wants to learn more because they haven't heard it, like yourself, Eamonn. And that makes it always exciting to talk about because people are interested in it.
So, well, first off, I know exactly what you're talking about with the accent.
Yeah.
It's almost like a Brooklyn accent or a New York accent.
It's like a Brooklyn accent with a little bit of a weird twist at the end, but it's a really pronounced Brooklyn accent. Yeah.
And are you tracing that like back to, I mean, this is hard to do, but are you tracing that actually back to Ireland? Do you think it's...
I can actually make a good argument for the fact that, again, going back to the French and Spanish heritage, or really the French language, because even when New Orleans or Louisiana was a Spanish colony, French was still the dominant language. So the governor spoke French, the people spoke French. So again, technically Spanish, but on the ground, everything is still happening in French. And then the Americans buy it, and we continue with this. It isn't until we get this large influx of English speakers in the 1840s, the Irish, and New Orleans being the second largest port in America, that you get that dominant English-speaking group, but it's being influenced by the Irish. And to me, there's a reason why we sound like New York, for the same reason. Port city, Irish, and when New Orleans is transitioning to becoming then English dominant with its language, it's in large part because of the Irish.
That's really fascinating. That makes sense. Yeah, true. Okay, I kind of hesitate to disrupt the flow a little bit, but by way of introduction, to answer the same question that I asked you, I did prepare a little musical video.
Oh, okay.
So here's the deal. How did I get interested in the subject of the Irish in New Orleans and New Orleans in general? As Margaret mentioned, I'm a piano player. New Orleans is the home of so many wonderful piano players. I know at least one great New Orleans piano player, John Groves, on this call today. But like when I was in Ireland, I listened to all the guys: James Booker, Mac Rebennack, Dr. John, Alan Toussaint, and going back to Professor Longhair and even Jelly Roll Morton. So I was interested in New New Orleans and New Orleans culture and New Orleans music. When I came to San Francisco about 20 years ago, I started working with a fellow called Zigaboo Modalist, who had a really seminal band in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and into the 80s called the Meters. And if you go, so you know the Meters. Some people wouldn't necessarily know the Meters, but if you go down to New Orleans, the Meters are like Beatles. And especially if you go down to Mardi Gras, all you hear is Hey Pocky Way, the Beatles version, and a couple of other songs. So I started playing with Zigaboo Modalist. I played with him for about good 10 years. He was based in Oakland at the time. And through him, like you, exactly your story, I started hearing about this area called the Irish Channel.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
And then, and I started going down to New Orleans and playing with other New Orleans musicians and meeting, just getting to know the place a little bit better and hanging out in the Channel with some friends. But then a weird thing happened to me as I started going back into the musical history of New Orleans. Zig was actually burning me CDs because I think my knowledge is a little bit perfunctory. I knew his music, but didn't necessarily know some of the other stuff. I started hearing these parallels between Irish music and New Orleans music. And it was like a lightning bolt, like the same song transposed from Ireland to New Orleans. So that's what I kind of have queued up in this video. And it's easier to play some music rather than to describe it. So I'm just going to share screen here and do this. Give me 1 second. And here we go.
As I went home on a Monday night, as drunk could be, I saw a horse outside the door, where my old horse should be. Well, I called me wife and I said to her, will you kindly tell to me, who owns that horse outside the door, where my old horse should be? You're drunk, you silly old fool, till you cannot see. That's a lovely sow that me mother sent to me. Well, it's many a day I'd travel 100 miles or more, but a saddle on a sow, sure I never saw before.
Last night I come home, tired as a man can be. I saw a mule in my stable, where my mule is supposed to be. I said, wake up, Sally, explain your stuff to me. Whose mule is that in my stable, where my mule is supposed to be? He said,
come on, you maidens young and fair, all you that are blooming in your prime, always beware and keep your garden fair. Let no man steal away your time.
Lord, oh love, get it love. Can't you see what can love done to me? It made me wrong and leave my happy home. It was love, oh love, get it love.
'Twas on one bright March morning I bid New Orleans adieu, and I took the road to Jacksontown, my fortune to renew. I coursed all far in money, no credit could I gain, which filled my heart with longing for the lakes of Pontchartrain.
So that last one there is kind of going the other direction, strangely enough. The Lakes of Pontchartrain has somehow become a traditional Irish favorite, but it's a story of an Irish man in New Orleans. Not sure exactly why. A lot of people try to research this song, but he falls in love with a Creole girl, according to the song, by the Lakes of Pontchartrain. And this song was taken, Christy Moore, who's a very famous Irish singer, learned it in an English folk club in the 60s, and now it's become the staple of Irish traditional music. So it's an example of a song going the other way.
Well, RTE actually just sent somebody over and to explore that sort of the
Ruth
lakes.
Smith, right?
And
Ruth Smith.
Yes, exactly.
I heard that show. It was really great.
Yeah, and so I was meeting up with them. We actually met at the St. Patrick's cemeteries in New Orleans, and to kind of use that as a spot for interview and like that. And she was surprised that it's not as popular in New Orleans. Like, it's so popular in Ireland and then here.
But to my knowledge, like it's like a mystery. Like songs are really interesting to me. That they're little nuggets of information that are passed through time, and it seems to me that she still didn't get to the bottom of the mystery. The mystery still exists, right? I mean, I learned a lot from the show. It was a great show, but I still don't know where the song came from.
She didn't know either. Like, you know, she was asking me like, don't you know? And I'm like, no.
Really interesting. So take, you know, putting aside, let's go to the beginning of the first Irish person that we know of in New Orleans, who it sounds like from your book, it was a fella called Alejandro O'Reilly.
No.
Okay, I got it wrong. So tell me.
Most people think it's Alejandro O'Reilly, and he's great to start the thing off because he came in to put down insurrection in New Orleans in 1768. But actually, what makes the story down here interesting, and again, different than the 13 colonies and the British American narrative that dominates US history, is that Louisiana was first a French colony and then a Spanish colony, and it becomes a French colony in 1699. So wars in Europe are on pause for a moment. They turn their attention to North America, and they decide this whole area, the Mississippi Valley, needs to be, you know, colonized by Europeans. So the British, the Spanish, and the French all send people out, and the French end up securing the Mississippi and become French colony. But it's a Catholic colony. And so the Irish that come here are actually Irish that left Ireland, often with the wild geese and all of that, and left Ireland and went to France. And then in France, they joined the military or whatever the reason, whatever they're doing in France. And then they come to France, they come from France to Louisiana. And oftentimes with the military, and some decide to stay and some decide to leave, but a lot decide to stay for the reason a lot of French people decided to stay, and that was land, the access of opportunity, you know, the usual kind of immigrant story there. When the Spanish when Louisiana, the French give the colony of Louisiana to the Spanish crown rather than let the British get it. So the Irish that we get in that one, again, are Irish that first went from Ireland to Spain and Spain to Louisiana. So it's a two-step jump, which is different than in the same 18th century. We get a lot of Presbyterians from Ulster who were leaving Ireland and going directly to one of the 13 colonies. So it's this kind of more circuitous route, but also they're going to a Catholic colony and they're Catholic immigrants, and we're not getting Irish Catholic immigrants. I mean, obviously a trickle come in, but really that's not what is dominant about Irish immigration in the 18th century. So it's a different story. But Alejandro is great because Louisiana, New Orleans put up the first insurrection. This didn't happen in 1776. We did it first. We failed, but we did it first. We rebelled against colonial powers. And the Spanish said, you can't do that. So they sent in Alejandro O'Reilly, came up the Mississippi with 2,000 men that disembarked right in front of what's present day St. Louis Cathedral and Jackson Square. They disembarked, they lined up in the square, and on command, they fired their guns and they shouted, "Vive el Rey," and that was the end of the revolution. Everybody, you know, took their oath of allegiance. Alejandro did actually quite a bit of reorganizing, and then left 8 months later and went back to Cuba.
Oh, okay. So he didn't stick around.
Nope.
And did I mean, were there other people who in the Spanish army who were Irish who kind of stuck around to?
Yeah, so probably the most significant was Oliver Pollock. Oliver Pollock came with Alejandro O'Reilly, and he stayed, and he ended up being able to, he got lots of the contracts with shipping and supplying the military and doing all kinds of stuff. He becomes a very wealthy man, and he was very, very anti-British. And so when the American Revolution does happen, so this is in 1768, 69. So fast forward a few years, 1776, and the revolution, the American Revolution starts. Pollock is funding Americans. He's sending money, he's sending guns, he's sending beef. He's doing all kinds of things out of his own personal account. But the governor at that time also was allowing Americans to come in, shipping flour to American rebels, which was really gunpowder, doing all kinds of things because England was their enemy. And they figured, yeah, let's help the Americans out behind the scenes. So there's a lot that happened here that, again, is not told. That's part of that narrative of the American Revolution. But no, we have quite a few that came with that initial military and kind of said, hey, let's check it out.
So at that stage, it sounds like New Orleans was bouncing around a little bit between being a French colony and being a Spanish colony until the Louisiana Purchase happened.
Yeah.
Like, how did that? The Irish who were there at that stage, I mean, how did that affect them?
So I think, we get actually, so the Louisiana Purchase was in 1803. And one wave of Irish that we get is from the failed 1798 rebellion in Ireland.
Okay.
Right? So they go in exile, but they also go to, again, this safe Louisiana Catholic colony. And that group was quite different because they were educated. They end up owning newspapers, using different, and they're politicized. They're really politicized, and they're politicized with being, sort of what we would think of like a Republican green, free Ireland mentality. And so 1798, so we get some people with that. Then America buys, Louisiana in 1803, and then we're in this weird space because Jefferson bought it because it's a great deal and you don't pass up on it, but he was really worried about it. It's a Catholic colony and they're French and they're Spanish and they don't speak English, and are they going to destroy the United States as we know it? And so we get this kind of hybrid state. So even today in Louisiana, we have parishes, we don't have counties. We have civil law, and we don't have we have like a Napoleonic code that dictates our civil law, but our criminal law follows British. We have forced heirship, things that you find in France and other places is the law of Louisiana, and it's not that anywhere else. To me, this is when the Irish start to become a community. I really see the 18th century and the colonial period as having kind of random Irish people that decide to settle in Louisiana or New Orleans. But in the 19th century and after the Purchase, we see the formation of an identifiable Irish community. And starting with 1806, what I could find proof for may have happened earlier, but in the newspaper, is the first publicly celebrated St. Patrick's Day.
Nice.
Yes. And it's so familiar in many ways because like the governor's there, the judges are there, they're all there celebrating. But in the newspaper, they published the traditional toast. And they do this almost every year that I could find. And what's really interesting is that these traditional toasts change each year.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yes. So I'm like, how traditional can that be? And there's like oftentimes they run like around 21 toasts. So I'm like, are they like drinking after each toast? Because, by the end of it, what I found really interesting is that, and I have this in my book, so you too can reenact if you want to. Certainly for 1806 to St. Patrick's.
I plan to reenact all 26 toasts.
Exactly. What I found interesting is that so the first one's the day we celebrate. The second one is the Mother of All Saints. Mm-hmm. And then number 4 is the memory of General Washington. And that really struck me. I was like, General Washington, why not President Washington? What's going on there? And then you look at the context, it's 1806. So for United States, we're in this great kind of lead up that's going to go to the War of 1812, right? The British are starting to impress American soldiers on stopping ships, and there's a lot of harassment that's going on. And the War of 1812 is even called the Second American Revolution. So it's sort of this memory of going back to the American Revolution, but also for an Irish community, it would have been, we fought for the patriots, right? We were the rebels. We fought for the patriots. We were there. We got the United States to become independent. And if there's ever a message that the Irish pulled out of the American Revolution, it's that you can be a ragtag force of people and you can defeat the British Empire, right? You can defeat it and be free. And this is that message that gets sent completely. Like, it's been done, so it can be done again. Yeah. And so it's a great source of inspiration, and it's always coming up. It's like that theme is always coming up in some way or another to the audience, that we need you at our back. We were at your back when you needed us, and we can do this. We can be free.
That's really interesting. So I had a lot of questions about that, like the effect of Irish revolutions in America and vice versa. So that you're kind of laying the groundwork for that there, and that's kind of where it began. That's really interesting. So sorry, you were going to say something more.
I just wanted to add one more point. Also, I think to add to the mentality, in case people think I'm like taking like a present day view and putting it back, but you know, at this time in the early 19th century, militias, the United States had no standing army. And so we all had militias, and militias, we had a Free People of Color militia, we had a French militia, we had this militias. They're not unified. And we also had an Irish militia that fought in the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, and they were called the Republican Greens. So, you know, in 1812, this was this really clear idea of this free, independent Ireland republic, shaping of the mentality, and that we'll see develop later on, but you see it early in New Orleans.
So and you've described them as maybe, especially from the 1798 rebellion in Ireland, these would be generally more educated, maybe a little bit more middle class people who left Ireland and ended up in New Orleans. So what would they work at when they got to New Orleans? What kind of jobs do they have?
So the whole mix and mash of it. So like the earlier people I get a lot more merchants. Even if they come in as clerks, they very quickly, like you see them rising, owning their own businesses. It's really after the fall of Napoleon, and the way kind of Europe shifts in 1817, 1818. So in the 1820s, we get that first group of poor Irish immigrants, the ones who are going to build the United States infrastructure, dig canals and do things like that, primarily male, don't come with families. And they come here to New Orleans also for that same reason. But I think what struck me the most is in 1850 is the first US Census that lists the occupation of everybody in the household. And when I looked at that one, is that yes, 50% of all the males 15 and older were listed as laborers, but 50% were not.
Yeah.
50% is huge, and 50% were everything: doctors, lawyers, teachers, clerks, cobblers, you name it, it was in there. And these are Irish born. And the thing about immigrants, and especially because it's 1850, so you're in the middle of the Great Hunger, and that whole migration, is that when you get off the boat, the first thing you need is shelter and food. And you may have only been there a few months, and you may have been digging ditches and been a laborer then. It didn't mean that in 4 years in 1854 you were still doing that. That there's a real possibility that what's captured in 1850 is this brief moment in time, that 50% in fact was not. Or as you encounter in New York, and I'm sure in San Francisco, immigrants who were MDs in their country but haven't gotten licensed in the United States, but their occupation is going to say, I'm a taxi driver, right? But it doesn't give you the full scope of what's going on there. So it just gave me a real sense of the diversity and complexity, that you couldn't just sort of say, oh, well, they were all digging ditches,
I'm trying to get my head around what it would have been like for an Irish person, especially when you're moving ahead a little bit. And I guess would the next wave be the people who, and you mentioned digging and building canals?
Yeah.
Would they have been involved in the building of the New Basin Canal? Was that the next like part of. And like that's a little bit before the famine, right? That's more like the.
Yeah, no, that's completely before the famine. So we look at different markers. Historians look at different markers to say, okay, when do you become, or when do you stop being just a bunch of random Irish people, and then you become a community, like a recognizable community. And we look at different markers. One is when do you see consistent celebrations, public celebrations of a feast day or a saint's day, right? St. Patrick's Day. When do you have like organizations or associations that help the needy? So we have a Hibernia association that gets formed to help the indigent, specifically the Irish. When do you have a church, right? The immigrant church, when is that formed? And so when you have those things come together, you say, okay, you now officially have check an ethnic community. And so by 1832, when they start the New Basin Canal, we had all of those. St. Patrick's was built. We had, the Hibernia associations, we'd had this built up. So we have a real recognizable Irish presence. And New Basin Canal is something that is well known here, but not outside of New Orleans. And it's a thing of myth. And it's a myth that I constantly am trying to bust.
Yeah.
Because there's just really almost no truth behind it. And to put it in context, if you come to New Orleans and you mention the word Irish, for everybody in the audience out here, you will have people tell you that 8,000, 10,000, 20,000 people died digging the New Basin Canal, and they were all Irish. And it's like there's two things that they know, and that's one of them. And so I looked into this, and I read every single newspaper. First of all, the canal was built from 1832, starts in 1832, and it ends pretty much by 1835. So it's a very short period of time. Second of all, we don't even have a population that could have handled that kind of high death rate. Third of all, it's really hard to get rid of dead bodies, even with swamps. But putting all that aside, I was like, this doesn't sound like the Irish. Like, how do you deal with 8,000 dead? And where does this start? And so there's a ditty here that was published in the 1930s, and during the Great Depression, 100 years later, in the Times-Picayune, that said 10,000 mixed, they swung their picks, and half as many died of the cholera. And that's where that 20,000 number comes from. Everybody knows that ditty, 10,000 mixed, they swung their picks. And so I looked a little bit deeper, and in 1832 into 1833 was a massive cholera epidemic that hit not just New Orleans, but Nashville, you name it. It traveled the waterways. People didn't understand germ theory. They didn't understand how this was being passed. And in New Orleans, 1832 to 33, we had about 4,000 to 5,000 people die of all groups, not just Irish, not just this. I think the bottom line is that I think there's a cultural memory of all these deaths, because the newspapers are filled with, what do you do with all these bodies? And they can't go and find people to collect them, and getting rid of them and burying them. They know having lots of bodies and not burying them is a bad thing. I think there was a collective memory. It gets then 10 years later going to get mixed in with the famine and with the horrors that those immigrants are going to bring with them. Fast forward, and we're in another difficult time, the Great Depression, and people are suffering. And you bring up this, our people suffered 100 years ago and doing this hard labor, and they died and they suffered. And it kind of just gets revived in this mix mash of things, and hence the myth was born. But the flip side of that is that what I did find in the newspapers, which to me in some ways sounds much more Irish, is that they protested the working conditions. They wrote a whole long letter to the paper discussing, and they were like, this is not okay. And the doctor, and we're having to use the company store, and we're not going to do that. And blah, 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 blah. In other words, the fighting Irish comes out, and that's actually what's in the newspapers, is the fighting Irish, and the ones that they form a proto-union. They actually unionize this kind of, well, proto-union, take those beginning steps. And that's what we see them doing after the Civil War, right? They dominate. They're the ones who form unions in the United States. They organize. They said, we're not going to take this. We're not going to like be dropping dead and just be walked all over. And so that's what I actually found. That's why I found the evidence for. And in many ways, for me, it's much more in line with Irish behavior in other arenas than this sort of like zombie, like dead, tens of thousands of dying.
Yeah, and I'll admit, like I used to think that, like I'd read that figure, and like when I started learning about the New Orleans and building the new Basin Canal, and your book corrected me. Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that, but let's backtrack, because I know a lot of people will be very interested in what prompted Irish people to leave in the first place. A lot of people know about the famine.
Yeah.
People might be a little bit less familiar with what happened before then, which is the penal laws.
Mm-hmm.
How big a force do you think the penal laws, and maybe you can talk a little bit about them for people who aren't familiar with the penal laws in Ireland, but how big a force do you think that was in people deciding to leave, first of all? And second of all, why New Orleans? Why did so many people come to New Orleans at that stage?
So, boy, they're great questions, and I'm trying to, like, the historian in me is like getting ready to give you the 30-minute answer, and I'm trying to give a 2-minute answer, and it's hard, again, as historian, brevity, any historian. But so the Battle of the Boyne happens in 1690, and King James flees, and William and Mary take the throne, and King Billy wants to establish his dominance in Ireland. He doesn't want James to come back and to lead Catholic forces. So they begin passing, they call the Popery laws or the penal laws. And I like to really emphasize this. They start the first one, it's like in 1691. And the last one that was passed by the British Parliament was in 1760. So this wasn't one monarch or two monarchs or one parliament or three parliaments. This is happening generation after generation after generation. And essentially it penalized you if you were Irish and Catholic. It penalized other groups too, but primarily if you were Catholic and Irish, you could not own land, educate your children, vote, own a weapon. Oddly enough, not own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. You could not take a custodial, or wardship of another. And you see them getting more and more severe. And as a historian, that tells me it's because they're not working. The idea is if you became Protestant, if you became Anglican specifically, then all these things magically went away. And if you didn't, you were going to be really, really punished for it. And so those who could went to France, right? That's the traditional enemy of England, France, and Spain, and their Catholic countries, and so they go there. Those who could, not everybody could. Some people also wanted to decide to stay and fight and circumvent it in different ways. You see a lot of setting up of different norms and activities, because when the law is no longer working for you, when you can't find justice, you have to set up your own sense of justice. And so, you see the rise of white boyism, this addressing social ills and injustices. But those that could went to these countries. So then again, when the opportunity arose and France is like, oh, hey, we've got these things happening in our colony of Louisiana, they go. The same way the Irish are going to end up in other colonies, because they're following through them in that way. And I think it's the idea of land. I think it's a certain, there's always the question about immigrants. Are immigrants in general bigger risk takers than your normal population? Because the vast majority of people don't immigrate, even in times of crisis. So if you want to look at during the famine, right, the worst part of the famine, population of 8.5 million, even then it's only a small percentage that immigrate, right? It's the minority that immigrate. So 2 million immigrate out of 8.5. 1 million or so die. why didn't 4 million immigrate? Why didn't more immigrate? And that's not unusual. It is always a minority. And so the question is those that make that choice, like yourself, Eamonn, I don't know how many people in your immediate family are in Ireland or living in other places, but there's personal reasons that pull you to a place, but then there's this kind of idea that there's a certain type of personality that's willing to take a risk for greater reward. And in an age of sail and a Catholic colony, the idea there was greater opportunity, or the possibility of greater opportunity, was there. And
well,
then
sorry, Laura, I very much identify with what you're saying. And one thing I've found, like I remember going to visit, like while I lived in Ireland, I visited a cousin of mine from a small little town called Kingscourt in County Cavan, and he lived in Woodside in Queens. From this little village in Cavan, about 50 people had emigrated. So like the word got back, hey, go to Woodside. There's jobs there, and there was you could get your check cashed in the pub, and you could find a job in the local pub in Woodside. So I think the word of mouth thing is a big part of, somebody comes over here and then they tell the people back home, hey, this is a good place to go. Yeah. But I want to delve into a little bit like why. Like I know a little bit about did people go via Liverpool?
Yeah, so they did. So it's kind of amazing because we think of, or certainly here in the United States, we think of people kind of coming directly from Ireland.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. I mean, we get the rise of King Cotton in the 19th century. So all kinds of things are happening that make New Orleans and the South this great place to be. For opportunities and economic possibilities, but they're going from Ireland to Liverpool then to the United States. And the ticket from Liverpool to New York, or the ticket from Liverpool to New Orleans, was pretty much the same price. And it's those ships that were sending full of cotton to England, and then they're empty. And so they want to fill them up with something. So fill them up with passengers. And for anybody who had an idea, because of course the gold rush is happening in California at this time, also that, if you could come up and be at the Mississippi, you could break away to the United States, because no one in Ireland or Europe has any concept really how big the United States is, right? It's just California, it's right there, And so there's this idea, well, we can do this and we can go to California, or we can do this other stuff. But what I found even more interesting, and God bless the Irish for having so many children, is following those who chose to come to New Orleans. And that tells me that they've a real desire. And by that, I mean, you see where the children are born. And so I'll get Mary and Patrick Murphy that are born in Ireland, and their first 2 children are born in Ireland. And then their 3rd child is born in New York. And then their 4th child is born in Ohio. And their 5th child is born in Kentucky. And then the last 3 kids are all born in New Orleans. And so besides the fact that Mary's got to travel pregnant and deal with small little infants, this is actually repeated, that particular route. Boston and New York, one of the ports up in New England, and then following the waterways. That's why they're born oftentimes in Ohio or Kentucky, and then whoosh, coming right down the waterways. And then the fact that their last 3 kids are all born in New Orleans is like they're staying there. They're not stuck there. They've made this conscious decision to come down and not leave. And then going to what you were talking about, like this small little town in County Cavan, when I look at the church records, people are marrying the same people in the same county. So they're not just marrying Irish to Irish, but they're marrying, Kerry is marrying Kerry, and Cork is marrying Cork, and they're still marrying within. And if I knew the villages, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they were in fact also marrying villages that were near each other too.
That's amazing. I want to let you know a little bit of an anecdote.
Please.
I did a little bit of research into Mac Rebennack. Dr. John.
Oh, Dr. John, boy, we miss him so much.
Oh, absolutely. Tell you that. But It's quite easy to go online and then check somebody's lineage. And I traced him back. He was Irish, and I'd read interviews with him where he talked a little bit about the Irish tradition, about his Irish heritage. He was Irish and German, Irish on his mother's side. And he talked about a little bit about how, according to him, the Irish music influenced the dirges that are played on the way to the cemetery, before they come back we'll get into the rituals around that later. But when I looked at his ancestry, when I traced back his mother's side, I traced it back to his great-great-grandmother was born in Fermoy, County Cork. And her name was Ella Fitzgerald.
No.
Yes. Now, her actual name was written down as Ella Fitzgerald. I guess her longer name was Ellen Fitzgerald.
Yeah, but still.
Somehow Ella Fitzgerald is Dr. John's great-great-grandmother. I can't quite work that one out. But anyway, I was intrigued. And again, I'm trying to get my head around what's it like for an Irish person. I'm picturing an Irish person arriving in August. Yeah, exactly. And you're coming from Cork or wherever you're coming from, Cavan, wherever it is, and suddenly you get this stifling heat. That's got to be crazy, first of all. But I'm very curious about how they dealt with that. How did they keep their language? Did the Irish language die out very quickly? And why do you think that? It sounds like maybe it did. And if so, why?
So first of all, I always try to picture that immigrant arriving here in 100% humidity at, 110 degrees heat, and thinking that they've just entered hell, and so I do feel for them, and thick clothes and everything else. I mean, it's a balmy day here now. It's 79 degrees in New Orleans, and it's cool. We have our windows open. I'll have a jacket on later. So, so yeah, I often feel for them. I feel for any kind of European immigrant coming into this heat and having no idea about it. But the language, I have to tell you, I haven't found a whole lot of evidence of Irish speakers here. And I often wonder if we even, how many we got, or if what we got was primarily English speakers. And also because after the Civil War, so after 1865, 1870, let's say we're in Reconstruction, Irish immigration to the city kind of goes to a trickle. And what we see happening in Pennsylvania and the Molly Maguires and these other groups of Irish speakers coming from the West to the United States, it's really happening in that period. But they're not coming down south, right? Because the age of rail has started, and we've got railroads. The age of sail is coming down. Cotton is no longer king. The South is a big economic mess. So as an immigrant, why would I go there when there's so many other opportunities? And especially out west, that the train can take you. And so I think when we get this large dominance of Irish speakers to the United States, it's later. And I think they largely bypass what we would call the deep South, of which Louisiana is part of, as opposed to the Carolinas or something like that. But it's something that linguists have asked me and have looked for, and certainly the evidence is scarce. And it may be the kind of evidence that doesn't get passed down, because if it's oral, you only need to lose a couple of elders in one generation, and then it's gone.
True.
It's just gone.
And could it be the case that the penal laws very much penalize people for speaking Irish?
Yeah.
So maybe you're emigrating to a new world, you're starting a new life. Maybe the last thing you want to do is you've internalized this, and the last thing you want to do is speak Irish. So you might
speaking Irish also, but they're also coming in, if you think about earlier, speaking French, right? French is the first language. So you're not even speaking English, but you're speaking French.
Yeah. So really, so the Irish that came over, would they have learned a lot of French?
They would have been speaking nothing but French. Oh, I have to tell you, this is one of my favorite stories.
That blows my mind. I didn't realize that. Sorry, go ahead.
No. So I'm doing all this work on colonial documents, right? So it's actually during the Spanish, but everybody spills only speaking French. Even the Spanish governors are speaking French, and they're writing in French. And I'm following this one case of a Maurice Conway and his land, and because he had actually bought a whole bunch of land from the Homa Indians, and then the Homa Indians refused to leave. And so he's now got this problem. He's got the whole tribe on land that he bought from them, but they won't go. So I'm following this thing through the documents, and there's lots of them. And then I come across this series of letters. And if I hadn't been following them, in other words, if I just kind of come across those letters without the larger context, I never would have known that Maurice was Irish, because they start spelling his name. Are you ready? Visualize this. Canouee. Conway. Conway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But without that context, I would have just been like, oh, okay, Maurice Conway, okay, whatever. Like, and you're so used to, usually Irish names are like, Alejandro O'Reilly. There's just nothing you're going to change about that. Murphy, there's nothing you're going to change about that. But Conway and Conway, and so it made me kind of want to go back and say, okay, I need to start really saying some things out loud more and see if they've got, they're not French. So what are they? Are they Irish? Especially when you get a lot of Patricks. But
that's really interesting window into that world.
Yeah, but everything's in French, and they're writing in French, and they're doing everything in French. So again, that's the main language.
When I was setting up and telling people that I was going to do this talk, a number of people asked me about this question, and it's a musical question, but I know you're not a musicologist or anything, but music is a product of culture and people traveling, and so and really the question is, people pointed out there's a lot of influence. They hear a lot of influence of Irish and Scottish music on Cajun and Zydeco music, and my understanding is that some of that, at least, or a large portion that comes from the Acadians moving down to Louisiana, from what was before what's now Nova Scotia in Canada. Right. But I'm wondering how many people, and I'm not asking for a percentage, but would a lot of people have moved out of New Orleans into other parts of Louisiana? And also, would they have moved westwards, or would they have moved to other places? Like, hey, this is too hot here. Let's get out of here, lads. Let's try somewhere else. In the second case.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that they did. Again, so like the beauty of the steamboat comes in 1812, and steamboat is this amazing thing because it brings you up against the current. And to show you how amazing a steamboat is, from New Orleans to the mouth of the Mississippi, so when you enter it from the Gulf, that's 110 miles. Now imagine going 110 miles upriver in a sailboat. You went at the walking speed, and sometimes they had horses and mules pulling the boats up. So you literally went at a walking speed. The longest part of your journey was that part of it right there, not the crossing of the Atlantic. And so the steamboat changes that. It makes going to St. Louis. There's a reason why St. Louis all of a sudden gets this large Irish population. It's people going upriver and look for them in these communities that they can reach by boat. In terms of like the countryside outside of New Orleans, absolutely. You see them owning farmland everywhere, and especially in the colonial period. But when we get into New Orleans and the importance of the port, where they dominate is in the city, and it's the economics. And that's even before the famine immigrants. That's where it is. And it goes into, and I see there's a question here from one of the attendees, but about slavery. And, in the South, in Louisiana, that the vast majority of people white people did not own slaves, or free people of color did not own slaves. So the kind of gone with the wind was the very, very, very small minority. Most people struggled. It was a family farm, and they struggled with that farm, and they did it. But what slavery did in the South, which was different than the experience in New York or Boston or elsewhere, is that it did set up a racial hierarchy. And so the poorest white Irishman was still socially and legally well above any person of color. And so when the Irish start to come to New Orleans in large numbers, and the 1840s, both before the famine and then with the famine migration, they start to take over certain jobs. And when they take over jobs like being draymen or port work, they would physically force free people of color out of it. I mean, physically, with bricks, with fists, and take over the job. And as a white person, they could do that. And so there was that hierarchy that existed. And to me, you see being played out today, right? You know, in the United States, and Black Lives Matter and things like this. Race is important. Race is a factor. It does control political, legal, cultural aspects. And it's a conversation that's important to have. And it was something that was happening then. So this is another, like, there's similarities of the Irish experience in New York compared to New Orleans or Boston. But then there's distinctly Southern things. And one of those is the issue of race and the issue of slavery before the Civil War and the what's like afterwards. Also the issue that the Irish fight for the Confederate, right? We always hear about the Irish fighting for the Unionists, fighting up in New York and the great riots that happen up in New York City. But the Irish also join the Confederacy in the South, and they fight for it down here, and they fight for it for different reasons. In some cases.
I was very intrigued to talk about that actually. It sounds like the Union forces took over New Orleans pretty early in the Civil War. But a lot of Irish fought for the
1862 without a fight. You're like, oh wait, okay, here you go. But actually, in some ways, it saved New Orleans, right? We don't get burned down because they didn't put up a fight. So.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about rivalries and between the tribes that composed New Orleans at that time, because there was all kinds of people there. There were Italians, French, Spanish, Irish, and African American, Germans. Yeah, exactly. So who did we collaborate with? And what ways did we collaborate with different tribes, and what kind of rivalries did we have besides the obvious one of competing for the same jobs?
Yeah, so again, there's this weird situation that is very particular to New Orleans. It's not a Southern thing or a Northern thing, it's a New Orleans thing. And that is, we have this Anglo-Protestant English-speaking population referred to as the Americans, who even in the 1830s, the Americans who were coming almost seemed like a foreign group. Who are fighting for control with what's then labeled sort of the Creoles and the Creole French-speaking, Catholic-speaking. And so much so that in 1836, the city of New Orleans divorces itself, and it breaks up into 3 different parts. And it breaks up into these 3 different parts, and you see this one reason for the New Basin Canal being built in the American sector. But the rivalry is really based on these cultural differences: American, French, Spanish, Creole, Catholic, Protestant, and the Irish maneuver between the 2 of them. You know, on the one side, they'll go with the Catholic and the Creoles. On the other side, they live predominantly in the American sector, and they're speaking English, and that's where most of the jobs are. And so they float back and forth and between this. And so then you've got this tension that doesn't matter about class. It's weird, right? You can have poor and rich on both sides. What really mattered is, were you an Anglo-Protestant or a Creole Catholic? And then the Know Nothing movement kind of takes over the United States. It's anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Irish. You know, America, as we know, is going to be destroyed by Irish Catholics. They take over mayors, governors, all kinds of political levels. They're getting elected, and they come to New Orleans. The Know Nothings come to New Orleans. And now we've got this weird things. We've got a Catholic city, but there's like this. And so they have to kind of navigate this space of being sort of anti-immigrant, but they can't be anti-Catholic. And so it's another weird division. And to me, the Irish navigate it very well, in part because they can speak English, and they navigate it better than, for example, our second largest immigrant group at the time, which were the Germans. So the Germans don't speak English. And then the Germans are also kind of weird because some of them are Protestant and some of them are Catholic. And some of them are Jewish. And so they're kind of coming from, they're not cohesive in the same way. And they also have that language barrier. And so it's not as simple as being immigrant American, immigrant native born. It's much more complicated than that. Makes it much more interesting to study, but it's a situation that's unique to the United States. You don't see that getting played out in other places because they don't have that heritage.
Yeah. Laura, I'm intrigued. At one stage of your book, you talk about 3 distinct Irish neighborhoods in New Orleans. First of all, the Irish Channel, and then the Third Ward, and the Bywater. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about, like, when was there an Irish Channel? I know it's hard, like, to say, okay, 1828 the Irish Channel was established. It's not like that, but I don't know how historians decide, okay, this is when somewhere is an actual neighborhood. But can you give us a broad sweep of when these neighborhoods became Irish?
So the Irish, it's really weird. New Orleans is based upon neighborhoods and very specific neighborhoods. I'll tell you, this street, that street is this neighborhood, except for the Irish Channel. It's quite nebulous. And what you see happening is the original city of New Orleans is what we call the French Quarter today. And it's bound by Canal Street and Esplanade. And we give all of our directions by water. And so Uptown is simply called Uptown because it is upriver from the French Quarter. And so as it was expanding outside of the French Quarter, you couldn't go to the back end of town because it quickly gets very swampy. And New Orleans is kind of built on a bowl, so you're going into the deeper below sea level areas. So you either go down from the French Quarter, which is the Bywater, or you go upriver from it. And upriver from it, which is now what our central business district is, and our warehouse, and then our garden district, and so on. That was getting populated by the Irish along the river because that's where the work is and the jobs. When the term Irish Channel was first used that we can document in the 19th century after the Civil War, by the persons using it, making it sound like this is something that was used commonly. But he makes it sound very kind of general, kind of like downtown area up to, the Garden District, this kind of general area. Then it gets more narrow to literally, they believe it's one street, Adele Street, then they believed it was one area. And then fast forward to 1970s, and real estate agents picked these designations and they call it the Irish Channel. So that's what it is today, which is ironically is that it leaves out most of what we would all say is in fact the historic Irish Channel involving St. Alphonsus Church and this original area there. That's not technically part of it. But when real estate agents want to do it to sell houses, that's what they did it. So it has really no historic basis. But the channel is a general area, but getting specifics to it is, you're not going to find 2 people who agree upon it, which is very Irish also. So.
And how about the Third Ward and the Bywater? Was that later on that they became?
No, the Third Ward and the Bywater were the same. So that's all pre-famine even, and then get filled up with the famine. Yeah, no, in fact, I would say that neighborhood in some ways was established almost beforehand. It was just a mix of immigrants there, and it's right next to the quarter. Also, an area that had a huge free people of color population, as well as other groups to it. It's a very diverse area, and the Irish were just one, but there are enough of them that they build a church. They have St. Peter's and Paul. And I always tell people that if you want to see where any one particular immigrant group settled historically, look to see where their churches are. That will tell you right then, like, that's where the Italians were, that's where the Lithuanians were, that's where the Irish were. And So enough where they had their own church, they had their own schools, they had the whole thing there. And I think it's proximity to the port, jobs, and it's not in the quarter. You know, you don't see a lot of immigrants of any group settling in the quarter. The quarter is pretty much, you know, that Creole population, and then towards the back there's a free people of color population, but that's also Creole. And so it's always kind of going to be sort of outside of that, that you see other groups coming in. That's where the real estate is available too.
Yeah, that makes sense. So anybody who hasn't been down to New Orleans for St. Patrick's Day,
should come. Just not this year, but should come.
yeah, absolutely. And they might be very surprised by what goes on, because I don't know that it happens anywhere else. I'm gonna do a little demonstration here. This is a genuine cabbage from a St. Patrick's Day. So when did we start throwing cabbages and potatoes and ingredients for an Irish stew on St. Patrick's Day? Does that date from the?
No. So I love this tradition. So our parades,
a dangerous tradition if you get
very dangerous. You have to pay attention. No turning your back to the parade. Our parades in New Orleans are interactive features. They are not, you do not stand solemnly and watch something happen. Any parade, Easter parade, St. Patrick's, you name it. We throw stuff, and we throw stuffed animals and beads and this and that, but only in St. Patrick's do we throw food. And it's the food that's enough for an Irish stew, except for the meat. So cabbages, potatoes, onions, garlic, carrots.
Have to quibble with the garlic. We'd never do anything as exotic as that in Ireland.
I know, but we had a little New Orleans twist to it.
That's the French influence.
Yeah. They also actually throw out bars of Irish Spring soap. You know, I mean, you name it. But funny enough, that tradition gets started right at the end of World War II.
Oh.
And the Irish Channel parade gets started, and it's not on St. Charles the way it is today. It was like on Magazine and smaller streets. And it would kind of go from bar, pub establishments to other ones. But they started the assessors, the politicians, the Burke family in particular, who represented that area there, the Irish Channel. They organized it, and they came up with this idea of giving out food. And if you stop for a moment and you think about, it's hard times, it was hard times in New Orleans, recovery was happening, and it's a way to give food and allow people to kind of save face and to make it a community effort.
Oh, I never thought about that.
Yeah, think about it's a lot of food. My first St. Patrick's Day festival, I was so excited, and I came home and I had, and I'm not kidding you, 30 cabbages. And then I looked at this and I said, what am I going to do with 30 cabbages, you know? And so it's a huge amount of food that's handed out, and it is a way of giving to the community. And then it's continued since then. So after an injury or two, the cabbages are not thrown, the cabbages are handed to you, but everything else is thrown. And I can tell you, getting walloped in the head with a potato hurts. So again, you're always face forward towards the float to see what's happening. And our parades last like 4 hours. They're not like, it's not an hour thing. It's easily 4 hours. So it's a long day. It's a fun day.
It's a very strange phenomenon that I've seen in myself becoming a child at Mardi Gras, you know, just talking about parades. And like, I really wanted to get this Zulu coconut. And so
you have to have it.
I was possessed. I had to have it, and finally got it and went dancing down the street like a kid.
I know. You're like, oh my God.
It's very
like getting a shoe from one of the muses, and you're just like, I got a shoe.
Exactly. That's what it is. So, you know, let's talk a little bit about some of the customs that we brought over. One thing I'm intrigued about, and I'm not sure if you talked about this in the book at all, Did any of our Gaelic games, Gaelic football and hurling, did any of them make it over? Did we play
They
that?
make so they make
Or
it over in the
oh,
20th century.
okay.
And we get, so you get that kind of transition in Irish communities around the United States, and I think around the diaspora, where Irish immigrants who are leaving and going abroad, the church is no longer the central unit where you meet people and where you make those connections, where you network, where you find out where a job is. The pub becomes that place.
Yeah.
And you land, you go to the pub, that's where you can find out work, construction work, this, that, different things. And with that kind of rise of the pub, and the rise of the Irish coming in, then we get sort of the rise of Gaelic football, hurling. I know before COVID, I mean, we have a GAA association here, but it's very small. And we just haven't had the same kind of traction. Like Houston has a much bigger one. But it is here. But I just don't think we have the same numbers that are needed to make it big.
In the 19th century, it sounds like boxing was a big thing.
Yes.
The Irish were famous. There were some famous boxers in the
Oh my goodness, there were so many. Also the Irish, fighting Irish again. We have this interesting kind of situation where like the Irish dominated, and John O'Sullivan dominates it, and all these things. And some of the most important games happened here in New Orleans, and I had no idea because I don't watch boxing. And it wasn't until I was doing work actually on one of our mayors, and he ended up being the referee to one of the most important matches, the match, that was with O'Sullivan, and I cannot remember his competitor's name, another Irishman, that ended bare knuckle fisted fighting, because that's what boxing was. It was without gloves, and the rounds also didn't have a specific time period. You fought around it, somebody was knocked out.
Oh, Lord.
And then you got back up and you fought again. And so this famous boxing match that happened in July, outside in the middle of the heat, and they went 75 rounds. 75 rounds. I still can't believe that anybody they could even swing, or that anybody was left standing. And Sullivan wins it, but because of that they ended it, and they brought in this idea of what's called the Queen's rules, and where you wore a glove, a round was only 2 minutes, you went back, and and all this other stuff. But no, the Irish got a lot of respectability off of that kind of fighting from general population.
Sure. You go 72 rounds in the middle of July, you get the respect. That makes sense.
Yeah.
How about actually, we were talking about food a little bit, like around the St. Patrick's Day, and I know, let's talk a little bit about the food and drink. Like one thing, as everyone knows, around where you go in the world, you'll find an Irish bar, and there's a lot of great Irish bars in New Orleans. Parasols is one of my favorites, but in the heart of the Channel. But and there obviously were a lot of Irish families, like the Brennan family, were a big part of the restaurant business, and Pat O'Brien's, was Finn McCool's. But have you at all been able to trace any foods from the Irish tradition of food to like what we know of as New Orleans type food?
You mean like influencing?
Yeah, influences of it's hard. Like you people are coming from a famine situation, so it's hard to talk about dishes. But we do have our foods and our dishes. And did you see any influence of that on what became known as New Orleans cuisine?
Not so much Irish dishes. What the Irish do is they end up becoming all the cooks, right? So they end up in all these middle class homes, end up cooking the food.
Yeah.
In terms of the restaurants, like the Brennan family, very important here in New Orleans, in multiple ways and levels and different restaurants, is they take over Creole cooking and then present it to a wider audience. And this is important because actually Creole cooking is what was happened in people's homes. And there wasn't this idea that you would have a restaurant to do it. Like you went to a restaurant for like fancy French food or something like this. And they took that concept of taking what everybody was eating in their homes and then brought it to a restaurant. And then of course, tourists and others all kind of was like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is great. But that to me was revolutionary, taking what was in your home and then making it available, that they did. And they own, I mean, it's a really important family, and they grew up in the quarter, not the quarter, they grew up in the channel. And Dickie Brennan is a good friend of mine, and his father. And, you know, they first had a bar, you know, the old Absinthe bar in the French Quarter, and this bar there, and even during Prohibition, which was something of a joke in New Orleans. And
Well, I'd love to know more about that. How was it a joke in New Orleans? It just never happened?
well, it never happened. There was a federal agent that used to go around trying to bust in all these places during Prohibition and drinking, and he used to keep as the story goes, he used to keep a tally on like how long it took him whenever he arrived in any new place to find a drink, an alcohol drink. And New Orleans won hands down. He got off of the train, which used to run on the back end on Rampart Street, so the back end of the quarter. He got off of the train and into a cab, and he said to the cab driver, "Where can I go get a drink?" And the cab driver handed him a bottle. So it was like 30 seconds.
Wow, that was pretty quick.
So that's pretty quick. So that was kind of the way Prohibition was handled there. And stuff. I see there's some questions here about Irish women. I'm happy.
I was actually going to raise that question. I'd love you to talk about
Irish women are great because Irish women are just great, period. But they are so fundamental to the immigrant story, and I don't think that they get talked about enough. And what a lot of people don't realize, and certainly for New Orleans, this was the case, that if a family could only, during the famine, if the family could only send one child, like it was going to have to be chain migration, and they could come up with a ticket for one, most people assume it would have been like the oldest son or something like that. And oftentimes it wasn't. It was the daughter, and the daughter got sent abroad, and the daughter went, and for numerous reasons. One, it's the age of that you had to have at least one maid to be respectable, right? So every home is looking for maids. So there's constant work. When living in a home, working as a domestic meant that your shelter was taken care of, your food was taken care of. It meant that the money that you earned, so much of it could go immediately back to Ireland, which led to the third point, and that was Irish women were much, much more successful at sending money back home than Irish men. Yeah, Irish men had a tendency to disappear. They arrived in New York, they sent to say, "Hey, I'm hello," and then you didn't necessarily hear from them again. And sometimes it was clear messages of, "I'm going out to California," and you never hear from them again. You don't know what happened to them. They may have died, who knows. And so there's that going on. But they come here, they're the bedrock, they help build the churches, they are intrinsic to chain migration, pulling over family members. And then New Orleans has probably one of my most favorite people, and that's Margaret Hoggerty.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and Margaret is this amazing, amazing woman, and in many ways, her story kind of takes the immigrant experience of all women. She and her family were coming over they were from County Leitrim, and they were coming over, and she loses her parents. She becomes orphaned at a very young age. She's raised by an aunt in Maryland. She marries, and her husband, they moved to New Orleans from Maryland, and shortly after arriving here, her husband and baby daughter both die. So now she is a widow. She is without family here, and she's also illiterate. And she begins she works as a washerwoman for St. Charles Hotel, right? So she's a laundry woman. And she starts to donate her time to the Sisters of Charity, and in particular to the female orphan asylum, which the sisters ran, making sense, right? In your grief, helping, seeking solace from the church, and in particular in this female religious order. And she notices that these orphans, who are primarily Irish girls, she saves up money to get a dairy cow so they can have fresh milk. And she gets 2 dairy cows, and she ends up with extra milk, so she starts to sell it to the neighbors. Within 2 years, she has 40 cows, and she now has a full-blown dairy business. And so she's taking her milk cart, and she's doing milk all around the city, and on the way back, when it's empty, she's filling it up with donations. She's always asking for donations for the orphans, donations for the orphans. This whole time period, she's always, to the day she died, she was illiterate. She signed her name with an X. And she starts to make small loans to people, right? She's making loans. I mean, her brain must have just been incredible, because she's making out all these different loans, and she's investing in all these different businesses, and she's got her dairy business. And at the same time, she's still donating so much of all of her money and time to the Sisters of Charity. And then she fast forward, it's the 1840s, it's the 1850s, and one of the businesses, the Deccan Bakery, which she'd been loaning money, and it was just failing, and she found herself the owner of a failing bakery. And she stops the dairy, she focuses on the bakery, and within, again, a few short years, it's the largest bakery in the South. It's the first one to use steam. She comes up with this idea of packaging bread and biscuits so they can be sent out on ships and can be shipped everywhere. I mean, the innovation of this woman was phenomenal. And on top of all that, she then always gave bread to anyone in need. But like, if you showed up, Eamonn, and you're like, I want some bread, I'm hungry today, she always gave you like half a loaf, because a loaf was enough that you could sell to get alcohol, but half a loaf was only what you would eat. And when she died in 1882, I believe, when she died, the Archbishop was there, former mayors, governors, pallbearers, I mean, incredible. And the second statue to a woman in the United States is to Margaret. And yet her story outside of New Orleans is so not known. And it's incredible. But when you look at those different segments, illiterate, widowed, orphaned, washerwoman, those were the experiences of so many Irish women. And yet it shows you the possibility of what can come out of that. And so it kind of goes back to that labor question I was saying before. Just because you're marked as a laborer once doesn't necessarily mean that you lack skills.
Yeah, it doesn't sum up your life. Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'd like to call out for questions, because anybody who has questions, I'm gonna hit you up with one more question though, because I think this is a big one, and then I'm gonna really open it up to the floor. But please, like, if you have questions, just write it in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. I don't want to take your whole day here, Laura.
Well, I can't believe an hour and a half. Oh my God.
I know, it's yeah. Well, really, my question is about ritual, and actually you were touching on it, rituals around death and funerals, and the Irish wake. And did the Irish wake, which is more of a celebratory, can be quite a raucous occasion, does that have something to do with the second line parades, where it's a solemn march to the cemetery, and then the jazz band plays on the way back? Do you think those two things played into each other, or are they kind of separate culturally?
I'm not to me, it's kind of a chicken and egg story. And I'm not a musicologist, and so I'm gonna say up front who influenced who. But I can tell you that in the 20th century when I was looking at Irish funeral customs, like in the 1930s and 1940s. So this is 100 years after the famine. And I'm looking at them in the Irish Channel, and I'm looking at them with the Irish here in New Orleans 100 years later. Certainly you see something like that. You see the dirge going in, and then the celebratory music happening afterwards. But they're playing different music going in, but it's that same tempo. What I found interesting is was the wake traditions that are happening in the home. And so in the home in the 1930s and the 1940s, there's the always like the staying with the body, the keening, but they don't call it keening, they call it the Irish cry.
Really?
And yeah, they do. So like neighbors in New Orleans would say how there was this, you'd have a wake still in homes, and 1930s, 1941, and they would say, oh, there was this wake down the street, and oh, I could hear the Irish cry, I could hear the Irish cry. And then they would describe it in other cases and letters, and it was quite obviously keening, and it also happened oftentimes at the end of the staying at home all night. So they'd stay home all night, the drinking, the eating, the celebratory, but somebody always stayed with the body. The body had to be positioned a certain way. So I'm going to throw this out there to the audience, just to kind of put it out there, because you never know what comes back. But something that they repeat often is putting a loaf of bread and a pan of water underneath the body. So they'd have the body often like on the kitchen table. They'd put a sheet over that. They would pin orange leaves all around. They'd pin camphor leaves. This is quite obviously for the smell.
Yep.
But then they often spoke about putting this loaf of bread in water in a pan out underneath the body. Now that's not to me going to do anything for the smell. I don't see why. And I've given a talk specifically about Irish wake, customs to museums and other places before. And I always throw that out there. And I haven't found a good reason why, but it comes up. It comes up in a lot of descriptions of these home wakes. So I'm just.
Have you encountered that in Ireland at all?
No. And I gave a talk one time in Cork, and I kind of said, okay, guys. And everybody in the audience were like, well, that's weird. I wonder where they did that. So nobody had anything. And then some other strange things is they'd also like put money on the eyes. So you get this like, river Styx, like pay the ferryman situations. But wakes are fascinating. And we still have, death is a celebratory situation here in New Orleans, very much, and it's also a very public one, and that's for anybody. I can turn a corner. We have cemeteries all throughout the city, small little cemeteries, and so jazz funerals are not for just big and famous people, and they're not put on for the tourists. These things happen all over in all kinds of ways in different neighborhoods, and it's a real public expression and a coming together of the community. And the Irish certainly had their own and embraced it. I think they did so probably because they brought something with them that added to it. So like I said, it's a chicken egg question, but there's an influence. You do see examples of it.
Do you have a little bit of time to jump into a few questions?
I do have a little bit more time. Yeah.
Let's grab a few questions here while we have you. From Eileen did any of the Irish religious teaching orders, male or female, and/or orders who specialize in healthcare at hospitals, play an important role in New Orleans?
They were the most important role in New Orleans. So again, it kind of helps that kind of Catholic city thing. And as an historian, it really helps because Catholics keep great records. They keep fabulous records. Yeah. And so in 1830, the Sisters of Charity were asked by the city of New Orleans to take over the main hospital. And so the Sisters of Charity ran the hospital for anyone. And so it wasn't just like, secular, whatever, it didn't matter. They were the ones running it. And then they started the female orphan asylum. And then they also then had school associated with that. And then they also had what was a pay school for like the wealthier people who wanted to send their daughters. We had the Christian brothers that came in that played education. In fact, almost all of our education is going to be done by Catholic orders. And we have the Redemptorists order that comes in. They're down St. Alphonsus, and they're still here today. The Ursulines came in first in 1727 in the French Quarter. We have the Marianites. We have the Sisters of Mercy. They were quite active with the Irish. Goodness gracious, we have probably the Dominicans. We have Irish priests who are going to Ireland and recruiting and bringing back. So what's sort of exciting in a way, and something when I talk about it in Ireland gets a much different reaction, but also a thoughtful one, is that New Orleans' relationship with the Catholic Church and Catholic religious orders specifically is very different than Ireland and Ireland's relationship with Catholic religious orders, and especially everything that's been coming out in the last decade or so about things that were happening. And it was just much more fluid here and open, but we still have all these religious orders. So we still have the Redemptorists, the Dominicans, the Sisters of Mercy, the Sisters of Charity, the Ursulines, and others that were here and that are still here. And when I've spoken to some, I've found that sisters, female religious, have a tendency to be incredibly practical people. And I recently was speaking with one, Sisters of Mercy, and I had said, are you worried? You're not getting a lot of young people. We had the Jesuits here. They still have young men that are entering, but I was speaking to her and she said, no, we formed when there was a need. And if our need is no longer there, if society is doing these other things, then our time is done.
That's quite
I was like, wow, okay, that's so practical.
It is. We have a question from Carol. Laura, you said you were not Irish. What is your ethnic background?
Oh, so I am Irish. Yeah, my grandfather's from County Roscommon. So I'm sort of, I think because I'm in Ireland every summer. Yeah. I try to be cognizant of being Irish American, and I know Irish Americans have a tendency to say, oh, I'm Irish. We do it also to say, oh, I'm French, I'm German. What we mean is our ancestry or our heritage is, but no, my grandfather came from County Roscommon, right smack in the middle of Ireland. Yep. And to show you how Irish I am, I went and had my DNA done, like so many people did, just for the fun of it, and it came back 87% Irish. What's even scarier is there was no Scandinavian on there. So I'm like, that's like a family tree that's got no branches.
Well, the Vikings never made it to Roscommon, obviously.
And apparently my people never left Roscommon.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Well, listen, I don't want to take up too much time. Laura, this is such an interesting
Thank you.
It was fascinating for me. I learned a whole deal. I hope our people tuning in enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you so much.
Get the book. Come to New Orleans. You'll love it. The book is it's a trade book, right? It's not a stodgy academic book. You can read a chapter. They're independent essays. I have to tell you, it's something I'm proud of because it's beautiful. It's got lots of pictures and this and that engagement and quotes and things that you'll enjoy. And it's a part of the United States and an aspect of it that not many people know about, and you should. And then you should also come to New Orleans.
I agree with both those statements. This is a wonderful book. It's a great coffee table book as well. Like just a beautiful book to have in your place. I have a couple of things I'm going to kind of push as well, because I have well, first of all, actually, this is probably the most pertinent one. This is an album of mine called The Irish Channel.
Yes.
Where I get into like some of the links between New Orleans and Irish music, and this is the latest one, which features a song it's called Black Coddle, and it features a song I talked about in that little video I did, which is Careless Love, but the Irish version is a bunch of times, so I kind of play a bunch of time bunch of time in the New Orleans tradition. So Laura, thank you so much. Wonderful discussion. Thank you, Margaret, and Irish Crossroads for facilitating this whole thing.
Yeah. Hopefully next time we can do it live in person. But I think, you know, I think our future might be a hybrid where we meet in person, but we allow to always kind of have a Zoom aspect to it for the people who aren't able to join us but want to listen in. So
yeah,
next time, let it be in New Orleans. Hopefully, maybe next year, 2022. And
you're on.
I'll host you, and you can do all the talking.
I'll see you there. You're up.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you both. Thanks so much. It was wonderful.